everyone, and thank you for having us today at the Global PayFest organized by JGA. Please let us present now the payroll transparency today and tomorrow. First of all, allow me to introduce myself. My name is Klara Cowan, and I am a Group Payroll Director at ASB, a leading advisory firm in Central and Eastern Europe. Over the next few minutes, I'll walk you through the key changes in a monthly payroll reporting in the Czech Republic and how these changes are laying the groundwork for greater government insight and visibility, which is ultimately leading towards the adoption of the EU Pay Transparency Directive. Why pay transparency matters now? Pay transparency is no longer a future HR trend. It is already reshaping regulations, audits, and employer credibility across Europe. In the Czech Republic, this debate is especially intense because high gender pay gap numbers meet the upcoming EU transparency rules. The key message from the start is that transparency depends on data, and payroll is where that data either stands up or falls apart. Let us now take a look at the Czech reality and how we explain the gender pay gap. The unadjusted gender pay gap in the Czech Republic sits around 18 to 20%, which is one of the highest in the European Union. But this compares all women to all men, not the equal roles. Once we compare comparable functions such as seniority and job levels, most gaps will actually drop down to below 5%, which EU legislation actually considers acceptable. So the issue is not primarily unequal pay for equal work. It is rather structural. Sector segregation, few women in senior roles, and the career breaks linked to long parental leave, which in Czech Republic can take up to 4 years. The pay gap does not suddenly appear. It accumulates gradually over the time. What fair pay then really means in the practice? The fair pay does not mean identical salaries. It means differences that are explainable and defensible. Those analytics will be shortly presented by my colleague Pavel from PayFair. EU pay transparency implicitly requires 3 basics. 1, clear job architecture. 2, consistent grading. And transparent bonus rules. As highlighted previously, Czech employers struggle less with salary levels and more with structure and data clarity. And once the transparency is mandatory, which is coming up in next year, the informal explanations will no longer be sufficient. So why do we believe that payroll is a backbone of pay transparency? Payroll is the point where all compensation elements comes together, such as base salary, variable pay, benefits, working time, and absences. And any inconsistencies in a job structure, pay setup, or working time logic become visible in the payroll very first time. In the Czech Republic, this is clearly illustrated by UMER, also referred to as Unified Monthly Employee Report. UMER represents a unified mandatory monthly payroll reporting framework through which employers submit a standardized set of payroll and employment data to the authorities. The report does not cover pay data alone. It also includes key employment attributes such as working time, employment type, and role-related information. As a result, payroll data is now collected in a consistent format that allows for comparison across employer and over the time. From a payroll perspective, this changes explanations significantly. Payroll is no longer only an internal operation process, but it is increasingly a primary data source for transparency, compliance, and potential audits. Data accuracy, structure, and internal consistencies therefore become very critical. So what can we take out of this? The pay transparency cannot be achieved without robust, well-organized payroll data. What are the biggest risks for employers? Through the UMER reporting, the employers effectively start reporting their own inconsistencies. Transparency creates risk. The most common issues are basic: missing employee data, inconsistent job classification, and unclear historical corrections. In a transparent environment, payroll is no longer just operational, it actually becomes evidentiary. However, well-prepared organizations treat transparency as an advantage and not a threat. They align HR, compensation, and payroll, invest in data quality, and make sure pay differences can actually be explained. This completely changes payroll's role from a salary processing to safeguarding pay credibility. The Czech experience shows that headline pay gap numbers need context, and transparency needs structure. Pay transparency is not only an HR topic. It is actually a payroll-driven discipline. Organizations with clean data, clear job architecture, and defensible pay logic won't feed the transparency because they will be ready for it. Thank you for your time, and now over to Pavel.
Hello to everyone, and thank you very much, Klara, for the introduction. My name is Pavel Vrtiška, and I'm one of the co-founders of the PayFair company. Our company focuses on the compensation and benefits area. We are building our solutions on three important pillars. The first is the market pay data, which we collect through our proprietary market survey. Then we are offering our methodology on grading and also on the area of job architecture. And we combine all these aspects and all these data within our own software, which focuses on compensation and benefits area, and which helps the companies to prepare ready-made salary analysis and preparation for pay transparency. And this is the reason why I'm talking to you today. I'm gonna guide you in this second part of the presentation through our recommended process, how to prepare on the pay transparency initiative to come. Before we cover these recommended steps, let me start with some myth and misinterpretations of the EU Pay Transparency Directive. What we hear from the clients throughout our consulting projects are some misinterpretation what the EU Pay Transparency Directive is going to bring. So first of all, first myth, and Klara already commented on this, is that the same position equals the same compensation. This is not true. In fact, the EU Pay Transparency tells that for the same position, there must be the same compensation rule in place, but not exactly the same pay value. The second one is that the European Union will dictate how much you have to pay for individual employees. Again, this is not correct. The correct interpretation is that this directive doesn't dictate how much, how or to whom to pay, but it remains or it keeps you the flexibility to create the objective criteria and based on them define how much money should each employee receive. Then we hear a lot that employees will know everyone's salaries in the company. Again, this is not true. The EU Pay Transparency only tells that everyone must understand the criteria which are relevant for his or her positions, but it doesn't mean that they will have any precise information about the exact amount of money paid to any individual employee. What you as the employer must tell everyone is the average value of the pay package which you pays for the category to which this one employee belongs to. Which means that, for example, if you have some positions of financial analysts and you have 20 employees within this position, then to each of them you will share the information what is the average remuneration for a pay analyst in your company, and also you should split this information to average of women, average of men population. So any exact information will be shared with the employees. You know that there is this pay gap limit, 5%. Klara already mentioned this in the introduction. And again, the doubt is that you must be able to pay it immediately if you identify that some, for example, category of the positions exceeds this limit. This is not true. In fact, there is the 6-month period which begins once you identify this pay gap, and only after this period, if you are not able to correct it, then you must initiate some, let's say, discussion with the employees' representatives. And together you will define the solution, how to correct this situation. So it doesn't tell us strictly that you will need to, fix the situation right away. Now let's deep dive into the main part of the presentation, where I will guide you through recommended steps from ourselves, how to prepare for the EU Pay Transparency Directive. We have prepared 7 steps, which will guide you through the preparation phase, and they are valid regardless of the market you are operating in, and also regardless of the size of your company. First of all, as a first step, we recommend to make the categorization and evaluation of the positions, because this is really a basic building block of the entire system. So in order to change the remuneration system or some remuneration policy, you first must be able to categorize it and measure it in order to make a change. We recommend to use the grading systems or grading methodology in order to define the work of the same or similar value, which is required by the directiveness. And as you can see, we are using very, let's say, straightforward system how to apply the grading on each individual position within the company. First of all, the position must be assigned to one of the job functions. The job function you can perceive as, let's say, a focus of work or area of the work. So it put together all the positions which have the similar functional focus. And you can see these are, let's say, the precise categorization, such as accounting, payroll, compensation and benefits, digital marketing, and so on. So we are not talking about the general ones, such as the entire marketing or entire HR and so on. Then within this job function, we need to identify the complexity of the activities. So this is the last part, which you can see in the bottom of the slide. And each function have 4 position levels, which are described in terms of the complexity of these activities. If we would like to introduce it in a very simple way, you can imagine this as the definition for junior position, medium position, senior position, and expert position. This is something which can help to navigate the system. And by these 2 categorizations, we can distinguish the grade for the position, because on the background in our system, we are using the pre-evaluated job architecture by our own grading methodology. So let's see how it works in real life. In this schema, you can see the list of job functions, and on the vertical line in the heading, you can see the grades, grading scale from 1L to 6H. And you can see each function spreads across 4 different grades, and this is corresponding to the position level, which I introduced on the previous slide. So very, very easily, you can define where to place each individual position from your organization. Once you do, the system automatically defines the job family, which is the categorization of more job functions together. So, for example, all HR functions are summarized together into human resources job family. And also we are, let's say, defining automatically something which we call career profile. And this identifies the similar type of work. So, for example, all technical positions are within the career profile technicians, regardless of the, let's say, functional focus. Based on these, we are using the job architecture categories, which is this job family, job function, and career profile. And we can use these categories to identify what are the same value positions, or what are the same what are the positions with the same value or similar value as required by the directive. And what you can see in here, I will highlight to navigate you, is that you have 2 different functions on the slide. The first one is finance and accounting. This is the job family. And the second one is job family IT, data, and analytics. Each of these job families are splitted further into this violet color lines, and this represents the job functions, which is the precise categorization. So you can see what is in the finance and accounting. We have accounting, financial planning and analysis, financial strategy, general financial specialization, and so on. And inside these groups, we have the positions which which were allocated from the company. So all the positions from the company are allocated into such structure. And what we can then identify, for example, if we take this data analysis group, we can see there are 3 different positions. We have senior data analyst. He is on the level 3. Which means he has the grade 5L corresponding. Then we have reporting specialist. This position is in the level 2, which means the final grade suggested by the system is 4H, which is 1 lower under the 5L. And we have data analyst, who is also on the level 2. So what we can now make as an interpretation, in such situation, you can directly say that the data analyst and reporting specialist, they are the same position value, because they both are in the same functional group. They both are on the same complexity level, and therefore they have the same grade. On the other hand, you can proclaim that senior data analyst is on the higher level because he has the level 3 complexity, and therefore he has higher grade, and the value of this position is higher than from the previous 2 examples. If we compare these different functions, we can make the same discussion. On the left side, we can see the analyst position, who is also on the level 2. And this corresponds to the same grade in this case, because these both functions are same valuable, or the complexity is more or less the same. So we can see that the analyst from the left side, who is in the level 2, have exactly same grade as, for example, the data analyst on the right side, who has the same position level and same grade as well. In this scenario, if there is no, let's say, further differentiation between these two functions, it's suggested to combine them together and to focus only on the grades of these positions in terms of the pay transparency categorization. If there are some important differences, then we can, of course, put some additional criteria to differentiate between the functional groups. Now, first thing is to identify the value of the positions by the grading methodology. The second thing, which is important, is to be able to discuss the differences between two positions, for example, on different grades or in different functions. For this, we recommend to use some additional materials, such as job positions, as you can see in here, which should explain the differences between different functions and different grades. And also, what we use in our system and our solution, we are providing not only the grades as the number or some identification of the grade, but we are using these grading profiles, which actually describes what are the differences in terms of the grading methodology. Therefore, you can see there are some differences in different aspects of the evaluation, and these are also very valid arguments in terms of the pay transparency categorization. Here are some numbers which we use just to provide you with some idea how detailed the categorization can be. So we are using 20 grades, 25 career profiles, 64 job families, and almost 500 job functions. Once you finish the job categorization, we recommend to move to the second step, which is the internal parity analysis. What does it mean? The internal parity seeks for some structural differences in the remuneration, which means that it helps you to identify where in the company are huge differences in the remuneration, regardless of the categorization of the job. Mainly, we recommend to focus on the two areas which are impacted by the Pay Transparency Initiative. The first one is to identify the gender pay gap, because this is connected to the reporting duty in terms of the directive. And of course, to identify the gender pay gap at all different categorizations across your organization. I will introduce it in greater detail in the upcoming slides. The second one is let's say, information duty that you have to inform all the employees within your organization about the average value of the remuneration for their position or position of the similar value. And again, I will talk about it later on. Let's move to the gender pay gap. As you know, there is this limit 5%, I've already mentioned it, and the EU expects that employees within all the categories of the positions within your organization will be below this 5% limit. In our country, in Czech Republic, the situation is not very nice. Based on the Eurostat, we have 18.5% in global within the Czech Republic. But the question is whether this number truly represents the unequal treatment of women and men, because what we saw on the market in the last couple of years, we are identifying the pay gaps in the consulting projects. is that very often it's more impacted by uneven representation of men and women in different positions or different levels of the organization. And only then we can measure the pay gap based on the equal work. So there is two main areas which influence this number. First, this is the structural representation of women and men in the organizations, and the second one is the true pay gap in terms that there is different value of work for men and women. We have verified this number based on our own pay survey, and we identified a similar value that overall, if we only compare the average earning of women and average earning of men, we have even more 20% difference at total. But we have also identified what are the reasons behind in terms of either confirm or reject about this overall number of the pay gap. So we have identified what is the distribution of women and men across the entire market in terms of the grades. And what you can see is that the situation is quite different for women and men. It's important to mention at the very beginning that in terms of the quantities of employees in different grades, usually the mostly assessed positions are on the lower part of the scale, and the higher we go, then there is less and less people on the market in such grades. So it doesn't mean that all men are here on the top. It just means that, for example, this grade 8H is distributed or occupied mostly by men in, let's say, approximately 80%, and only 20% or maybe even less is occupied by women. So if we see this chart, it's obvious that the average value of the men is very impacted by the senior management positions, which are mostly occupied by the men. And on the other hand, the women usually is more dominant in, let's say, the middle part of this picture, and therefore they are not so occupied in the top positions in the organizations. Of course, in each country, this might look quite differently, but this is the situation which we have in Czech Republic. Now, if we move on, because we were interested whether this is, let's say, valid in general or not. So if we take the same schema, but in different segments, what we can see is that, for example, in some financial sector, there is a huge proportion of women in the lower positions, and the situation on the top remains more or less the same or very similar. So there is a lot of women in the financial sector or professional sector, services sector, which in our case stands for example, some consulting agencies, accounting agencies, and so on. Then if we take a look on the digital business, which is, let's say, IT organizations, e-commerce, and also the manufacturing industry, because there is a huge similarity in men and women distribution, therefore we communicate it at once. You can see that there is quite smaller proportion of women across all the spectrum, and for example at the very top positions usually there are no women at all. So the next question for us was whether it means that if there is more women in the organization, it will, help with the pay gap situation. What we can see in this chart is the categories based on the percentage of women in the company, which means in the first column there is usually 10 to 20% of women from the entire population, in the second column 20 to 30, and so on, up to the highest category, which is 70 to 80% of women in the organization. And on the vertical scale, you can see the pay gap. And as you can notice, there is an increasing line, which means that the less women in the organization there is, the less pay gap there is in the company, which might be quite surprising. We were at the very beginning, we were surprised as well. But once we considered all the factors and, for example, the schemas from the previous slides, it makes sense. Because the more women there is in the organization, usually they are on the lower positions. So it means that on the higher positions there is even more men. And then the difference between these two extremes makes the entire pay gap number increasing, even though there is more women in the organization. What you can see in here, we have analyzed 60 plus different functions in combination with grades. And for each individual function, we have made this analysis, whether within the same function, the pay gap across individual grades remains under the value of 5%, which is the limit. And as you can see, more than 45 of them meet this condition that once we follow the positions which have the same functional focus and same grades, then the men and women are paid equally. Only few of them are somewhere shifted to the sides, either to the left, which means that there is even the minus pay gap, which means that women earns more within these functions, and on the right that the men earns more in these functions, but it's really just few of them. So the situation is not as bad as it's communicated in media, where we see the overall number 20% or 18.5, but we need to really explain what is behind this number. And as you can see, once we really compare the same positions, which is defined by the function and grade, then we meet this this criteria defined by EU. This was the first impact factor of the EU pay transparency, which was the gender pay gap. The second one, as I referred to at the beginning of this chapter, is the, let's say, equality in terms of how many employees are far away from this average value, which you will have to communicate to all employees. So in terms of being able to measure this number, we have created our own index. We call it PayFair index. And what this index monitors is the individual deviations within the category of these positions, and also some characteristics of the entire monitored group. If we simplify, we have created this index which is from 0 to 100, meaning 0 is a very bad situation and 100 is excellent situation. And in order to be able to communicate it in a very pragmatic way, we have identified the score A to E, like in the schools, which means the A is like functional system. You can explain the differences only based on this job architecture, which is very, very nice situation. And the E stands for the situation where there is no system at all. There are huge differences and therefore huge risks for you as a company. It doesn't mean that, for example, if you are on the C score, that is a bad situation necessarily. It means that you cannot explain the differences in the remuneration only by the job architecture, which means, for example, the combination of grade and function, or, for example, the career profile. But still, you can define additional criteria which will help you to explain these differences. How we use it in system, just to provide you some idea how you can make these kind of analysis. We are identifying this, let's say, summarization report, which is based on the function, the job family, which means the more generic categorization to the functions. And within each function, we are identifying how many employees we have and how are they distributed in terms from the internal internal median or average. It depends on which metric we would like to use. We prefer to use the internal median. And as you can see in here, the more people you have in the middle column, which means that they are plus minus 5% from internal median of this group, the better the situation is. So as you can see, for example, in here, we have all 5 employees within this middle group, and it means we are in very nice situation. We have the score A, 96 points in the index, and this means that we don't need to make any changes in terms of the remuneration to this population. On the other hand, we can see we have some functions with which have the C score, for example, IT software development, IT general, and also finance and accounting. So let's have a look to one of these function to let's say higher detail. And before we do, you can identify that usually it's because a lot of employees are far away from this middle point. Therefore, there is huge differences to be explained. Once we identify these groups, which we should pay attention at first, you can see that we can drill down into the detailed analysis. And we recommend, of course, to using this kind of analysis to be able to identify the gaps on the individual employees basis, not the entire population. So as in this example, you can right away see which employees are, for example, below some expected target or line, and you can then identify whether at first or you can verify if they are rightly assigned into the job architecture, because very often through this analysis we can identify that, for example, somebody is in the wrong grade or wrong category. So this is the step number 1 in terms of the correction. Step number 2, if they belongs to this group, is to identify how many employees and how far away you have, and then focus on them within the correction phase. From this chart, it seems they are quite okay. There are some differences. We can see how many employees are below or above these middle lines, but we also recommend to use some kind of aggregation on the grade level. So if we make it compact like this, you can right away identify that, for example, problematic grade is this 5L, because there is a huge differentiation in terms of the overall pay for the employees. After the internal analysis, we recommend to continue with the external parity analysis. And the external parity compares your organization with the market. Therefore, it's about competitiveness. It helps to identify whether your salaries are on the competitive level or not. So this is also the important factor in the overall package once we discuss the entire remuneration system, because you can make it as fair internally as possible, but if it's not competitive enough, probably you will have difficulties to recruit the employees from the market. If you would like to make the analysis of some market data which you have, we recommend to first identify what is the environment to compare with, which means that you will identify, for example, some particular industry or, for example, some particular region. And then, of course, you can identify the differences on the employee level. So if we start with the regionality, just to provide you some idea, this is of course specific for Czech Republic, but based on our pay survey, we can identify that the Prague and let's say middle part of the Republic is paid somewhere higher, and the remaining part is lower, as you can see on the chart. It's important to mention that this situation might look quite differently for different sectors or industries. So, of course, we recommend to follow the differences not only on the overall market, but also in the specific industries which are relevant for yourself. Once you identify the regionality and you would like to identify, for example, which industry to use, we recommend to make an analysis across the market data, so you can identify the position of, for example, two different industries, whether they grow the same or not, which means the growth of the curve, and then if the remuneration structure is the same. These are three main, let's say, parameters which individual industries or even regions can, of course, differ. How to do the industry analysis? If we provide you with very simple examples, you can, for example, select the industries you are interested in, such as in this example, and you can put them in one chart so you can see the differences right away. From this chart, and this corresponds to our data from Czech Republic, you can see that, for example, industry of technology and digital business, which means IT companies, e-commerce, and similar focus, is higher on the market, especially in these specialist segments, which means these are really the non-managerial positions which have the expertise, the know-how, and it's paid quite above the market nowadays. On the other hand, the management in the IT sector is paid somewhere in the middle of the market. What we can see on the first side is, for example, this brown or green-brown curve, which corresponds to manufacturing and industry. So you can see that at the bottom, it, let's say, is very close to the other sectors, but the higher grade we are moving to, the lower below some midline it is. And as the final step, once you identify the appropriate data set to compare with, we recommend, of course, the individual analysis, which means to put each individual employee in comparison with the market. The comparison with the market is the gray field on the bottom. And you can then see how many employees is below the market value, how many is above the market line, and how many is inside the expected market range. So very easily you can navigate in your company and identify how many extremes do you have, and then you can assess it individually, of course. Now, in this phase, you should have the categorization in place. You should have the internal analysis and identified the extremes which you have within the remuneration. And you should have done the external competitiveness analysis, which means the position of your remuneration in terms of the market comparison. Now is the right time to move on and or analyze your current system and the governance model, because before you will suggest any changes to it, you need to validate what is the current setting. If we talk about the remuneration system, we usually build this system on three main areas. First, this is the job architecture and grading as a basic foundation, which means the position classification, job evaluation, job descriptions, competencies, and so on. These are the reasons why, and based on which criteria you identify the work of the same or similar value. Then we have the position segmentation and salary policies. This is a topic for the upcoming chapter, so I will not comment in very detailed approach right now, but just to provide you with some idea, what is the position segmentation? As I already covered in the previous sections, we recommend not to use the very detailed categorizations in terms of position categories. What we recommend is to join together all the functions which have similar behavior, similar profiles, similar requirements, and only differentiate, for example, the functions which are from whatever reason, difference, but you know that you can explain this differentiation through objective criteria. Once you do the segmentation, then for each individual segment, you will design the salary policies, and we will talk about it in the upcoming chapter. And the third part, and we will cover this right now, is the governance model, which means what are the roles within the system and what is their, let's say, responsibilities and expectations as well. So let me introduce the main common role within the remuneration system. It's of course a role of the organization, then a role of the manager, and a role of the employee. If you have, for example, trade unions, they will also play an important role within the overall system, depending on what is the setting with the trade unions and what, for example, responsibilities or possibilities they have. Now, if we talk about this role split, why do we need to realize what is the situation? Because in a lot of companies where we do the consulting projects and which we prepare for the Pay Transparency Directive, we see that from whatever reason, for example, some historic reasons, they didn't have in place the remuneration system, and therefore, for example, the role of the manager is quite misinterpreted. And what does it mean? That in the real life, the managers treat themselves as the main owner of the budget for the remuneration. They can distribute it by any way they want, and they don't have any concept or any criteria at all in the current setting. Of course, this might have worked in the past, but this is exactly what the Pay Transparency Directive goes against. So if you have such situation in your company, it's very important that you realize this is your situation. And then I have a bad message for you, because this is a cultural problem, because it's more difficult to change the mindset of the managers than to create and implement the new system. And you have to keep this in mind and start as soon as possible to working with managers and explain them what is their role within the system and how you would like to correct it. Now let's go one role after each other and explain what is the possibilities and responsibilities this role have. If we start with the role of the organization, obviously the role of the organization is that you should design the system, the strategy of remuneration, the rules, the processes, and so on and so on and so on. So you are responsible for the system, and you have the accountability to create it or design it from the first to the last parameter. So at first, you should, at the very beginning, differentiate how many grades or how many number of tariffs, if you use, for example, some tariff systems, you would like to use. The more grades or tariffs you will use, the more you will differentiate in terms of some position specifics and so on. Then, of course, at each grade, you can identify whether you would like to use, for example, some spot evaluation, which means that in this grade, everybody have the same value. We don't recommend this at all. Of course, in some companies, we have met with these settings, but from our perspective, more suitable for the modern, let's say, approach to the remuneration is to keep some flexibility, which means that you will define some salary range where the employees can be placed in based on some other criteria. The higher range you will use, the more recommended from ourselves is to put in place some additional rules for employee distribution, which means that, for example, if you have some midpoint of this grade and you are, for example, used to put employees plus minus 20%, it creates huge differences for the top and the lower employee within this range. And therefore, if you would like to stick to this system, you must implement some additional rules or parameters which will explain and argue why somebody is on top of this range and somebody in the bottom. And of course, then you should design what we call the strategic position, which means what is the curveness of the line, therefore how much increase you would like to apply with each additional grade. And also you should consider your position to the market level. So this is where the market benchmark take place in, and you should identify what is the current situation and what is your required situation for the future, because maybe you will identify that you are already above market, but it's not necessary for you. So you can spare some money, you don't need to increase as much as the market for some time, and you can use these costs or this amount of money differently. On the other hand, if you identify that you are below the market and it's not required for your company, then of course you know that you will need to increase more in upcoming years than the market. And then, of course, not to forget about the variable part of the remuneration, because it plays a very significant role, especially in some companies and in some sectors, for example. So then you should identify what is the variable pay for each individual category, or as we call it, segment. What is then the role of the manager? The manager should apply all the rules and navigate each individual employee within the system. So, of course, he should determine the salary within the range. He should make some assessment of the employees in terms of this distribution. So, for example, if you use higher bands or higher ranges, and you would like to split them into 4 categories, the categorization, for example, is connected to what we call some position maturity, which means that you will evaluate how effective is the employee within the position, and based on that, it will distinguish whether he or she should be at the bottom of the range or on the top. And then in the long term, they distribute the budget exactly based on these criteria, which is the comp ratio with the recommended value, and also, for example, this maturity in position categorization, or any other which you would like to use. And then, of course, they define the KPIs and evaluate the goal achievements, and therefore, let's say, help to identify how much money from the target amount the individual employees should receive based on this variable pay component. Also, of course, they can, develop the employees throughout the system, so they can identify employees for the promotions and so on. And if you use such system as it was introduced in here, you will then very easily navigate even in regards to the remuneration. So if the employee is promoted to the higher grade, for example, you can see where is the starting point for his grade and what is the opportunities for the future remuneration perspective. And if we just conclude with this employee role, then of course the employee must understand the system. This is the regulation requirement, and he or she should understand what are the criteria based on which you are defining the grade. What are the criteria which is connected to the compensation itself, and what is, for example, some possibilities for him or her how to navigate throughout this range. The fifth step, we recommend to make the position segmentation, and once you have the segments in place, design the salary policy for each segment. What does it mean? The salary policy should answer the fundamental questions, and this is how much you have and the possibility to pay to the segment or to the employees within the segment. What do you want to reward? Which means what are the criteria based on which you join the payments, and how would you like to split the remuneration packages, which means, for example, the fixed pay, variable pay, and some, for example, additional categories. If the pay policy is designed all right, it should fulfill these three basic functions, and this is attractiveness for the new employees to come, which means that you are able to require the employees to the company. Then the retention function, which means that the conditions are okay for employees within your organization, so they are not leaving and the fluctuation is okay. And third is the motivation, and this is connected, of course, mainly to the variable part of the remuneration. It's important to mention that it should really be motivational, which means that there is no sense to have a variable pay component if you don't measure the outcomes of the work and connect it to these measurements. Because if you only have the variable part on the paper and automatically pay it to all their employees, then it actually undermines the attractiveness factor because for the newcomers, this is just some promise that they will receive it at the end of the year, but it's not guaranteed. Therefore, maybe in these situations, the question is whether to keep this variable part or not. And of course, we are talking a lot about the salary and, for example, variable component, but don't forget about the additional factors of the remuneration package, which are, for example, the benefits, but also, for example, some supplements and other categories of the overall pay for the employees. The EU Pay Transparency and all the averages which you will need to report either to employees or to the local legislations, it will be calculated across all the pay components, so all of them will be involved. Once you create this remuneration system, we truly recommend to also prepare a salary increase process in order to, let's say, guide the system in a long term and use it to improve your remuneration situation. Let's now see one mistake which we identified in a lot of companies that with a good sense, let's say, they set the rules that everybody will have the same increase in terms of some percentage. But this works only within some, let's say, theoretical situation, because usually not everybody is, for example, on the market line or some reference line which you would like to use. And then it stops work, because what does it do? Let's imagine the situation as on this chart, that on the bottom, the employees on the lower grades, they are somehow below the market line, for example, 17%. On the top, they are above the market line, for example, 15%. And the company decides to increase everyone's in the organization by 5%. The market is increasing in average 3.5. What does it do in 5 years after this exercise? So you will make this 1 year, second year, third year, fourth year, and fifth year, and you can see that the differences is even higher, because as you are paying more than the market, you are accelerating the employees who are already above the market line, but you are not increasing enough to those who are below the market. So what is the recommendation? How to make this salary increase more consistent? We recommend to use At first, the so-called comparatio factor, you can see this in the above table, or the top table. So you are identifying how far from this reference point is each individual employee. If he or she is, for example, below 70%, then they will have the highest possible increase, for example, for point A. If they are, for example, 90 to 100, they will have the increase 4%, and so on and so on. And then you can combine this factor with additional criteria, which means, for example, as we introduce this position maturity categorization, you can combine it together, and you can tell that, for example, on this entry level, they will have only 75% of this number. If they are, for example, in the advanced level, they will have 125 of this number. So you will combine both criteria together, and you will create this kind of matrix, which reflects both categorizations, the comparatio on the vertical and position maturity on the horizontal. What does it mean? That you will have exact calculation in each individual employee, which will tell you whether to increase, for example, 2.4 or 5.9. How does it work in the real life scenario? If we use the exactly same situation as from the previous example, but we will differentiate this 5% increase on the entire company level, and we will distribute it based on these two-factor analysis. In a 5-year time, you will nicely decrease the differences, and everybody will correspond to this line, which you take as, for example, some recommended values of the remuneration. So this is the recommended approach, how to use it long term and how to somehow close the gaps which you have at the very beginning. And the last step is to create the governing documentation. Again, each country might differ the local legislation, whether it's mandatory or not. In our country, in Czech Republic, it seems it will be mandatory based on the current suggestion of the local government. So we will see at the end of the year how, after all the changes, how it will look like. Regardless of the legislation, we still recommend to have all the criteria and all the remuneration system within some, let's say, governing documents, so you can share it with your employees and they can understand the remuneration system for their category, which is relevant for themselves. If you create this documentation, of course, it's the step 1 in this chapter, but then we also recommend to think about the transparency level, because you don't need to provide them the information about the entire system, the entire population within your company. So try to distinguish what is the level of transparency you would like to use. Whether, for example, to communicate the pay ranges or the grades, and so on and so on. Then don't forget to train the managers, because if you introduce the new remuneration system, it's very important that you onboard your manager population, because they then need to follow up these rules and apply it to each individual employees. And also, as you can see in here, inform the employees. This is even the requirement of the directiveness, that you will share the necessary information with them as well. I thank you very much for the attention. This is everything for today's sessions from my side. Here are some contact lists if you would like to get in touch and, for example, use the system which we have, or to consult, for example, some situation in your company and together find a solution for it. Thank you very much and have a nice time.